Let's complete the login validation test by testing the situation when the validation fails. In this case, we are going to create a new test case that says should return a 422 if validation fails. We'll make this function async, and first we are going to set up the request. It's going to have a body, but it's only going to contain a valid password. Next, we are going to say the next should be equal to just.function. And now we need to set up the response, and the response has to be able to do exactly what the original response does. So the response should have a status method which is chainable, and an adjacent method that takes an object and returns. So first I'm going to create a simple class called response. This should have a status method that takes in a status and sets status on the class or object to be equal to the status, and then it returns this so that it's chainable, and then it has a JSON method that takes in some data and then it returns data. Now our response is going to be equal to a new response instance. Then we are going to spy on these response methods to make sure they are called, because that's the only way we are going to verify that they actually work correctly. Remember, we are trying to mock out the original express response object so that we are able to test it. Now that we've successfully mocked it out, we've created a new response instance. We need to know if the status method was called and if the JSON method was called. So we are going to say just.spyOn, and the spyOn method takes in the object we want to spy on and the name of the method we want to spy on. And the name of the method in this case, the first one, is the status method. So we're going to save that status. So I'm going to say constant status spy is equal to this, and we're also going to create a JSON spy. Just.spyOn the response object and the JSON method. Now we can call await login validator, and we'll pass in the request, we'll pass in the response, and we'll pass in next. Before we run any assertions, let's run our test to make sure everything is fine. Now that we know everything works fine, how do we test? So we are going to expect the status spy to have been called. We can also expect the JSON spy to have been called. And now if we run our test again, we have a successful test. If we go to the login and instead of responding with this message, we just return maybe the error, then let's run a test. We have errors that say the mock function was not called. So let's bring back the response.status.json, run our test again, and yeah, I have to get rid of the return error. Sorry about that. Let's run the test again, and now we have a successful test. But how do we make sure that our spies were actually called with the correct inputs? Remember, we are spying on the functions in this object, so we have a bunch of possibilities. We can also spy what they were called with. So for example, we can expect that the status spy was called with a 422 status code, because that's exactly what we are going to expect in a real application. And great, now we have a successful response. If we come back to our login and instead of returning a 422, we return a 400, then we run our test. Great, we have an error that says expected mock function to be called with 422, but it was called with 400. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So that in the future, if a developer just changes this out of nowhere, the tests are going to fail. And this is really important, because if your API is exposed to the world and all of a sudden everybody in the world who is consuming your API suddenly begins to receive a 400, things will go wrong. So you want to make sure that you have tests like this in place. Okay, so we can also assert or expect that the JSON spy was called with some data. And notice the structure. There's a message, so we want to assert that it was called with an object that has a message property, and then we have a data errors object. Okay, so we have the errors path and the errors message, and we are not going to know exactly what this is unless we've worked with the YOP validator before. So in situations like this, it's okay to peep at your test. Okay, so now I'm gonna run test, and I know this is going to fail. And now if you see, it gives us the error, email is a required field, and we can simply add this to our assertion. So this is cheating, but it works. Unless you're actually doing TDD or actually working with the YOP validator, you're probably not going to know exactly what it returns. And once you do that and your test fails, you know exactly what to expect. And now, if we run our test, it's successful.